Hello, hey Paul. Hey Marco, morning.
Hey, Brandon.
Hey, welcome back
Thank
to
you.
this hemisphere where the water goes the other way.
It's so cold here. Oh, man, can't believe it.
What's the temperature down there?
Um, it was a bit colder than other summers, but I don't know, maybe like low 80s. Um, it's also
It's
been
nice. It's a nice
22 around
temperature.
there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was good, but like a lot of days it was too cold for the beach, unfortunately.
That's fair. Well, at least it's better than now. No, none of the days are warm enough at the beach. So.
Yeah, I can see why that just sounds like I'm complaining.
Okay, okay. Uh, cool. Maybe hi.
Hello.
So
Things seems like today's gonna be a light day. Looks like quite a few folks are making it.
yeah, I don't know if we'll decide um, what to do about V1.
Definitely not without without lots of people around, but I think we can probably go through some of the um, chat about some of the open issues. Awesome. All right, I think we can get started. Um, Hi everyone, this is the GUAC meeting. It's a meeting call. This call is being recorded. It's going to be put online. Um, Participation in the call is in adherence with the Code of Conduct for OpenSSF and the Linux Foundation, as well as LF antitrust policies. More details on the website if you are curious. um, so this is the maintenance call. We generally talk about ongoing issues, ongoing PRs, um, as well as kind of roadmap planning. If you do have any topics that you like to talk about, feel free. There's a meeting notes, which I will link in the chat right now. Feel free to add yourself to that. It looks like Well, at least there are two names that I'm not familiar with today. So, does anyone want to say hi, first time coming, or it's been a while since you've joined the call? Ayush and Paul, do any of you want to introduce yourself? If not, it's fine. Or if you want to introduce yourself via chat, that's also okay.
Hey, Paul here. We're from GuideWire. We've been using we're like users of GUAC. Just wanted to get an idea of things. We're joining the meeting. Hi there.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so next logistical question is on MLK Day meetings, which I think is a public holiday in the US. So it sounds like we're going to cancel this meeting. Okay, and then we have the GUAC community meeting on Thursday. This happening this Thursday. We can go through some of what there is. Let me share my screen actually. Community meeting. Okay, there we go. Cool. So for this GUAC community meeting, I think we have a couple of ladder climbs that we recently promoted in the community. So awesome for all the folks there. Robbie, Nathan, and Ben. We'll be announcing this during the community call. I think we're gonna chat a bit about the releases since last meeting. Feel like Path has been doing a lot of releases. Path and Ben have been doing a lot of releases, so I think I'm gonna defer to them to fill out more details here. I also know that there's Ben's blog post that he wrote on kind of coverage of all the features and all the releases that we've built since in 2024. So I think that's something that we'd like to share as well. Do we have any other announcements to make for the community meeting? I know we recently submitted a bunch to different conferences. I know Marco and I got a, a talk accepted at FOSDEM, which is mainly focused on S-bombs, but because we're talking about S-bombs, we'll fit in some GUAC in there as well. Any statuses from like KubeCon, or is that not due yet?
I haven't seen anything. I haven't heard anything back from KubeCon yet.
Okay. Cool. Anything else we wanna chat about for the community meeting this Thursday? I think there's a few cool features that we've had recently. I think this particular one I really liked.
Sorry, quick question, just to make sure I understand. Aren't those the notes for
the community meeting on Thursday.
aren't those for like the previous
Oh, this is.
date, or am I?
I think it's 116. Am I looking at the right thing?
Oh, these are the notes for the. Oh, got it. I thought these were for the maintainer meeting. My bad.
Oh yeah. No, I think we're just planning agenda for Thursday. So, I think this one was really cool. Apparently, there's a data doc certifier about Robbie created the Datadog certifier, which uses the Datadog malware. Malware, thinking about data set, which apparently I think is based off a bunch of threat intelligence and some sources, but apparently there's just this repo that they have. Apparently all the entries are all human vetted, so the data source should be of fairly high quality. Yeah. But I thought this was cool. I think this, like, given the size of kind of the implementation, I reviewed this, was actually like pretty simple, which meant that adding a certifier is actually a pretty simple thing to do, and people should be able to, whenever they're given a new data set, be able to do that. We did receive some feedback. I asked for some feedback from Robbie on, like, what can we do to make this better, and he gave some thoughts on, like, he gave some thoughts on how we can make it better, maybe by creating interface. Some of the CLI stuff seems to be duplicated. I think we can do some deduplication there. But overall, I thought that this was I think that this is a cool feature. So I think we can show this for the community meeting.
A quick thought about that. Do we have a list of like non-in-tree certifiers that exists?
Non-entry? Sorry?
Like a non-part of a GUAC organization. So like, is there a way we can point to this and maybe future ones that appear somewhere in our repos so that people can use them?
Not at the moment, I think.
Sorry, I'm
Is there, what are you particularly thinking about particular use case, or like a particular user that may want to do something specific with it?
So my understanding is this certifier is not going to be living on the GUAC organization, or is it merging into the GUAC code base directly?
It's merging to GUAC code base.
Okay. Do we have a way to support somebody just writing their certifier, keeping it on their own organization? My understanding is yes, because it's really just a service that's living outside of a.
Yes.
Is that the better approach, or would it be, or should we be encouraging people to merge it into our code base? I'm thinking of like what they say about improving scalability of adding new data sources and so on and so forth. I would assume that there's a process, and maybe if there's like third-party certifiers, we can at least encourage them to write it on their side and then slowly let it float up into the organization. And what we can offer people is like, here's a directory of third-party certifiers that we have seen. But maybe I'm thinking too far ahead. I don't know how worth discussing this is.
Yeah.
So I think that can work, but we also had the plans to refactor the entire GUAC architecture like into the free components. And I think having the plugins would work much better on the new architecture. And speaking of that, I remember at last community notes, you presented some slides on this. Maybe we can also talk about that on these community notes, on these community meetings.
Yep. Yeah, let me add that in. Oh, this is entry that says, what do we want to do about 1.0?
Oh, perfect. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's update on that discussion. So, been reviewing. Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are happening here, right? I think we are reviewing with Red Hat folks. I think there's some work also that that I've been doing on our Google internal supply chain and trying to map it to the GUAC ontology as well. So I'll put it here. Which I would like to share at some point, but I would like Path and Jeff also for some additional feedback. So keep that for next time. I do like Santiago's idea of showing like, oh yeah, this is, you know, everyone wants to kind of create their own thing, and like, oh, here's like a suite of products, right? When you create a project, you know, say like we're integrating all these things. I think that would be nice. I'm also thinking, you know how I'm not sure whether you saw this one, Santiago, but like right now, I think how you handle like creating a new certifier and all like that is like you can create your own service, you can run it as long as it's compatible to GUAC version. You can just run it in Kubernetes in the same deployment. I think the challenge is like I think there's only a handful of people that are deep enough that they know how to go do that. I really like Dejan showed a demo of like the platform that they created, and then they wrote a bunch of like collectors and stuff for their version in Rust. And what it was like one of those interfaces where like here are the different collectors and certifiers. So it's almost like a marketplace or like a configuration where you click it, it's like enable, and then it goes in. I think that is like the holy grail, right? Like we have a way for everyone to say like create a certifier, you can publish it. Obviously, that's probably going to be like a ways down the road, right? Because then we have to figure out like what do we show as default, what do we show as third party. You know, obviously, you know, we don't want people to put malware in there as well. But yeah, I think I do like that. I also do think that there is a like Mihai said, we are doing the refactor. I feel like having it in one place may be at least good for now. Until we get something stable. And then I think what you suggested with like the playbook of like here's what you need to do to create a certifier, here's what you need to do with a collector. I think that would make sense. Is there a particular timeline that you're thinking about, or are you kind of like in conversations with other data sets or folks that may be interested in doing
So
something like that?
from where I'm coming from is I'm talking to two groups. One of them is there's this like data science hackathon group at Purdue, where effectively you get a bunch of students and competitors to write code to solve a challenge. So part of what I was hoping is we can start finding data sets that we would find interesting and see which team can do more with that using GUAC, almost like making like GUAC data science hackathons. The other one that I was thinking of is, or what I'm trying to do is, a lot of the papers that I'm writing with some teams, like for example, this malware one where we run like a malware scanner on a bunch of Linux distros. We could effectively turn that code into a certifier and be done. As in like, I would assume that it's just effectively a Lambda that's attached to a bucket. And then we can like really start sucking in the whole internet while we write papers as well, which I think is cool.
I think that kind of aligns with what Robbie was saying, where it's like if you can just create an interface, like that Golang interface of what is required for a certifier, and then if you put that code somewhere, it will automatically go into the certifiers. And I kind of And what I think what you're suggesting is almost like a research infrastructure for the research community to go do all these things, right?
Yeah, so you know, I've been very grumpy about this whole like we write papers and then nothing happens, right?
What do you mean
So
nothing happens?
at least what we could do is just have people write papers and then stick them on WAC, and then we can like build a lot of insight eventually, right? It's if you're doing all of this like detecting backdoors and source code, well, why don't you certify your results and stick them on WAC in the ontology and see what happens. I think that would be a very sort of like interesting experiment to push the sort of like WAC capabilities on the like medium to long term.
Did I kind of summarize this in a I'll take up a action item to create a issue on how to make certifiers and collectors potentially easier to implement. Cool. On that note, would these would kind of still need that to be some kind of consistency with the identifiers, right? Like I think what was the what is and let me give a concrete example. So I think in this data docs, malware data set, we needed to do some weird stuff where okay, let me find it. Oh no. So for example, this was the data set. Right. So just like the path, the namespace, and all these things. I think what happened in the code that we needed to do here is we needed to kind of do a little bit of fixing on the namespace.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
ironically enough, I worked on this for a paper, on this data set for a paper. The problem with that data set is that they just effectively downloaded a bunch of PyPI wheels, and then they run the scanner, and then they saved it on their repo. So they didn't preserve, for example, the username.
Mm.
They literally just like, oh, this is called 0000 something dot wheel. I'll strip the wheel out, and that's what this thing is called. So I think that is a little bit of like their fault, and I wonder what we can do is help them, help people who write the certifiers to preserve the ID from where they downloaded the wheel. This dataset, they built it using a tool that they wrote called something like Garth Dog, I think it is.
Yeah.
Which you just take the tool, you point it at a PyPI repo, and then downloads it on zipzip, and then runs like some bunch of like static analysis rules on that. But I think what they did is they just like hooked on that, and then they just, instead of deleting the wheel, they just preserve the name and save the result using that name. It would have been interesting if the certifier was also a collector. And I guess that's an interesting question. If I wrote a collector that effectively p-opened their tool and said like, okay, now I'm going to, like, I'm iterating over these data sources. I'm going to download them. I'm going to preserve the Perl from where I downloaded. And then it run a scanner, and then well, it's not a collector really. Scratch that. It's really not a collector. It's like a daemon that could be thought of as a sort of collector of sorts, but it's not a collector because it's not collecting the metadata. It's generating the metadata. I don't know if that distinction matters. Am I kind of just rambling?
So I think that's just the fuzzy boundary between the collector and certifier, right? I think the only distinction that we have between both of them is really the data that goes into the inputs the outputs can be the same, right? I think the inputs are the only ones that are a little bit different, where collectors use inputs that is not the graph, and then certifiers use inputs that is based on the state of the graph. But like we have like the scorecard collector, for example, which can potentially I think in the scorecard collector there is a mode that you can run in which it will run the scan on the repo and then
Yeah, so
output.
that's why it started hesitating, because an interesting thing that could be useful is the data source. It's not being collected per se, but it's a collected, processed, and then stuck into GUAC, right? Could I make a live service that does this scan, or that checks for certificate expiration and somehow sticks it as a sort of like an attribute to an artifact, or it can do any sorts of things that we could automate to like build perspectives, but you really need to run a tool that generates the metadata, not just gets it and then like translates it.
Do you remember the stuff we had with like the collector subscriber?
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of like this registrar, right? Where you would say like, oh, this string, this identifier is important to me. Here's a kind of broadcast to the world of collectors to be like, give me all you know about this particular thing.
Right.
And that sounds like the hook that you're talking about.
Yeah. I wonder if part of a refactor would be to also rethink that architecture, because I think that's useful. And maybe what these folks need is not a certifier per se, but they need this sort of this third thing. Because what they did is they effectively did their own collection, then they run their tool, and then they certified the results.
I think yes. um, I think we said that we would redesign that feature. I think the way that we had it, other folks please chime in if I remember incorrectly. I think the way we had it was that it wasn't very scalable, And so ideally we want like a proper ecosystem with a pub sub, with like a little bit more intention on like, why do I have this identifier in here? And that will be used as like a feed to collectors. Now, I don't think that for most of the use cases that people were looking for today, or like the way that we're using the collector subscriber was like, oh, I'm ingesting this I'm ingesting this pearl. I want to know more about this pearl in terms of like vulnerabilities and like source information. And so the so-called hack that we have today is that we run these additional collectors at just in time on ingestion. So we run depth of depth. We run, I think, OSV, and I think the legal one, and potentially soon EOL. I think we have a PR open on that. And then we're just like doing that on ingestion time. But that's a hack that we're doing in the meantime. But I think we've agreed to do a little bit more built out solution there.
On that note, is this refactor being documented like anywhere? As in, like, these are the like major things that we want to rethink? Because I think it would be cool to try to taxonomize, like effectively saying this is a collector, this is like the one thing that it does, this is a certifier, this is the one thing that it does, this is this thing, this is the one thing that it does. Also to guide people decide exactly what do they need to write. I could draft something up, but I would need some eyes. I don't think it needs to be too long. It's almost like a snippet of a documentation that we can put somewhere.
I think that'd be super helpful. Just like even just the taxonomy of like what should collector be, what should we be using. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Jeff, any thoughts?
No, I'm just joining, trying to figure out what's going on.
Oh yeah, we've been talking about collectors and certifiers. We talked about the one that Robbie created, which was the Datadog malware certifier thing, and then that led to a bunch of discussions on other data sets that like San Diego and the other research community have been doing, and like it would be nice if like today doing the certifier, like if you look at Robbie's PR, is the actual logic of doing the scanning and the results is not too bad, but like adding the CLI for the certifier is a little bit of a little bit messy. And then we were talking about, oh, what if we had an interface that researchers could implement, and then you almost have like a research ability to take all the research work and then just dump it into an instance of GUAC and then have it do all the analysis from the paper.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of the boilerplate on the CLIs is annoying. But yeah, just like a list of certifiers that, you know, just get run or something makes a lot of sense. But I don't know, was there a discussion about like sharing data, or is it just about writing the certifiers?
I think it's more on writing certifiers. I don't think maybe sharing data is part of it, but I wasn't sure Santiago was the plan for like Purdue to host a GUAC, like, or the research community to host a GUAC and then have all these things together.
Yeah, I'm trying to say like, hey, oh, you have this data set. Why don't you just certify it? Or like, why don't you just produce a WAC graph of it that we can then ingest? Or like it would just be very cool if people started producing this sort of like machine manageable data that we can then use to combine multiple data sources for supply chain research.
Is that like a Acme equivalent of that the research community, the supply chain research community uses as the example data set?
With Acme, you mean like to identify a researcher to like authenticate their data?
Oh no, I was thinking more of like you know how let's say in machine learning or something, they all have these like canonical data sets, right? Where they're like everyone
Okay.
runs their research on that data set, and therefore you can compare the results. Is there like
We
yeah?
don't, I think. There's the backstabbers knife. So that's, for example, one of the things that I think we could write a little paper about. There's the backstabbers knife data set. But you can't access it unless you ask for permission for it. Even the malware scan results, like they keep it to themselves. That's the one that a lot of people use. There's this Garth dog data set, which is also like I run this tool on my stuff. There is another website that I don't know if they closed down or changed names. It used to be called Malware Bazaar, where you could download a bunch of malware from like different samples and then just run tools over there. But I think it would be very cool if we had if we produced something like this. Like here's a TensorFlow that you tell it like, hey, load this mnist thing. I don't even need to have the file. I'll just like stick the string of the name of the thing and it just comes to you. I think it would be cool to have something like that too. And we could start there. I don't even get me started with SBOM data sets. I think that I used the GUAC one, for example, for another paper the other day because there's really not a lot. And they're all like, oh, I run SIFT on this thing, done.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there was like a set, basically GUAC data for like an example organization where someone would collect this data for a hypothetical company or like an actual example company, anonymize it, and become the supply chain data set in a sense.
I don't think there is. I need to. Yeah, I don't think there is, unfortunately. We're kind of lagging on that side as a research community and supply chain. Everybody just kind of like, for example, I rejected a paper recently because they were detecting backdoors on open source, like repos. They had 5 samples, of which 3 were like test projects from like Indian students on the same class that got a backdoor in their NetBeans installation. And it was like, well, yeah, it has like a 90-something% detection rate, which is strange because you could only do like 100 or 80, but of which like 60% is the same sample effectively. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool if there happens to be a project out there that kind of did something like that. I remember like back when I said IBM research, we had these like sample applications that we were using for all these things.
Yeah, there's this project. I don't know if you know KPCYRD. They wrote a tool called Shadow Up, which like lets you inject backdoors from like different update like pipelines that I think is kind of cool. And I think we could use that to also like see the data set. But I don't want to like digress too much. But this was like a certifier. Okay.
Cool. Do we have any other topics that we want to chat about? If not, I think I'll go through like the PRs and see whether there's anything that we need
A few
to
weeks
chat
away, but I'm going to be going to FOSDEM, and on the day zero, there's the event that Philippe runs. That's the open source license and security tooling group. And there's an opportunity to present plans for the group. We'll present GUAC in general, which I did last year, but also present plans for GUAC. So if we want to present like a summary of our V2 work or any other kind of potential integrations or desires for people to, a lot of other open source tools authors are going to be there and project contributors. So any kind of like plans or other desired integrations that we want to present, we can. So last year there was like a printout, which I don't see that on the agenda this year as far as bringing a printout. So I think it's going to mostly be verbal. So anything that, so I guess I'll prepare, or I guess me and Mike's going to, I think, we'll prepare like a bulleted list to go over and write down on the whiteboard and things like that to discuss. So if there's anything anybody wants to bring up or dive into, happy to do that.
When do you get in, Brendan?
I think I get in. Well, there's only one flight a day to Brussels, so I think I get in on Friday morning.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to check, but I know that Friday and Saturdays and Sunday I'll basically be there for the entire days.
I will
I think I'm
also
on that
be
flight as well.
Wait, is everyone going to FOSDEM?
I think everybody in this call may be in FOSDEM, but I'll be wearing my Arch Linux hat rather than my LF hat, but I should be there. I think I saw Brandon and Mihai. Don't you have a talk? I think Marco, you also have a talk, don't you?
So everybody
we
but
have-
Mihai, I think, has a talk.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, I also don't have a talk. I submitted
Oh.
something. Yeah.
Mihai, sounds like you better check that website to see whether your name is secretly listed somewhere.
I mean, last time I checked last week, the AI one didn't go in, so we still didn't receive any email though, so I don't know.
Cool. When you say day zero, is that Saturday or Friday?
Friday. So if you can go a day
Okay.
early to get there, that might be beneficial.
Okay. But this is this like more legal stuff, or is this like kind of just like this?
So 5 years ago, it was all legal, but last year it was about half people there were focused on security. It's the same problem. It's really, just cataloging your dependencies. But yeah, there's the SBOM folks are all there usually, like Gary and Alan was there last year. I don't know how much was represented on the Cyclone DX side. There might be more this year. I heard some folks from SAP that are working on it are going to be there as well.
I feel like it. Besides the refactor work, I feel like the software identifier work is something that we may wanna kind of sounds relevant for that.
Yeah, I'll send some updates about that too. We may be swapping people around a little bit this year to help with progress.
Yeah.
But I think also just like having additional folks know that this is happening, because I feel like we've been kind of working on it in our bubble for now.
I could prepare some sort of like slides or like a rundown of the problem and whatnot.
Yeah, they don't allow slides, but if you have some blurbs or some bullet points, I'm happy to read them. And
I could
trying to
write
get
something
people
down.
excited about it.
When do we need to send this over? Or is it like casual, like almost like we need to send it over?
So this is just everybody gets to go a chance to go up and talk in front of the group.
Okay, but like,
anything.
where does this text appear? Would I type it on the terminal or like, or do I just
Like I
can
will
do
read
my-
it. I will read it. I will
Okay, got it.
bring it, print it out and read it.
Okay,
On the
sounds good.
31st. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Mike, did you want to say something? Did we cut you off there?
No, I was just gonna. No, nothing.
What's your hot take?
I was just gonna comment on if anybody's ever seen Philippe's presentations, they are very slide heavy, so it's funny that there's no slides.
Cool. Um, yeah, I think it'd be nice to talk about the 1.0 stuff, but I feel like Ben and Pop would be good for everyone to be like all the maintainers to be there for that conversation. Is there anything that we're aiming for before the conference that we'd like to?
Well, technically, I wanted to discuss if we can pull out the clearly defined coordinate to Perl logic into a separate repo under the GUAC org, or if that's something we're hesitant to do to like essentially start a new project or something like that.
Can you elaborate a bit more? It is. Yeah, are you saying the pull? So I don't fully get the.
Yeah, so there's the clearly defined uses something that's before Perl was invented to identify projects called a coordinate. And so to be able to look up projects and clearly defined, Parth wrote a GUAC, a Go library. It's buried inside GUAC to convert a Perl to a clearly defined coordinate. And so, yeah, we could have. I plan to use that whether we pull it out or not for some tooling. But if we want, I think it's a good idea to pull it out into a separate repo. And that would be, I'd want to do that before for the conference.
That sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me too. I think we even copy pasted some of that code into some of the sketches we were doing for the software ID stuff. So I think maybe have it as a like software ID core library that has not only the Perl parsing, but any other sort of like manipulation of identifier strings would probably be useful. I don't think it needs to be super big, but I think we can make it not just that code, but like everything that looks the same if you squint.
Yeah, we have a number of Perl helpers, I think. Makes sense. All right, I'll be working on that then between now and next 2 weeks.
Yeah. I think it'd be nice, like once if we can get to the point where you throw in a string and then we give you like a canonical identifier. That would be nice. Cool. If I have a topic for next week, to kind of talk about a draft ontology of what the new JSON/proto ontology could kind of look like. I think there's a few points where I don't think I'm fully convinced yet, so I'd like to get some feedback on that. So if we have time next week, I'd like to talk about that.
Are
Any
we meeting
other?
next week?
Sorry.
Are we meeting next week? It's
Oh,
the
yeah, you're right. I guess the following week. Yeah, fine. Any other topics for the last 10 minutes, or any other requests to review certain pull requests or others? Cool. If not, we can call it early for today. Awesome. See, remember to apply for your visas for FOSSum if you have to.
Yeah.